Welcome to the National Pulse. I'm Raheem Kassam, editor-in-chief of thenationalpulse.com. Today I want to talk about coats and turncoats. Dan Coats was the former director of national intelligence who sat on so much information pertaining to the Russia hoax and the monitoring of President Trump's 2016 campaign until Rick Grinnell came along and declassified it so the world could see what a phony situation that whole thing was. And having failed to cover up the cover-up of the crimes of the political establishment, Dan Coats is now doing the bidding of the Transition Integrity Project, the CCP-linked Soros entity that wants to deny Trump an election night victory under any circumstances. Those were Hillary Clinton's own words. Coats came out this morning with an opinion piece in the New York Times. I want to get that up on screen for you here. It says, Dan Coats proposes that Congress creates a new mechanism to help accomplish this purpose. It should create a supremely high-level bipartisan and non-partisan commission to oversee the election. Continue the quote, such a commission must be composed of national leaders personally committed by oath to put partisan politics aside, even in the midst of an electoral contest of such importance. They would accept as a personal moral responsibility to put the integrity and fairness of the election process above everything else, making public reassurance their goal. He goes on, he says, commission members undertaking this high historic responsibility should come from both parties and could include congressional leaders, current and former governors, elder statespersons, former national security leaders, perhaps the former Supreme Court justices David Souter and Anthony Kennedy, and business leaders from social media companies. He goes on to conclude, this commission would be created by emergency legislative action. Sound familiar? It should. I've warned about this here on the National Pulse show, on the War Room show, and on social media for months now. In fact, here's what I predicted just this past Monday. Let's roll. Let me tell you why that bureaucracy is so bad. Much like all bureaucracies, it's inherently corruptible. It doesn't really answer to anyone. But during the Brexit vote, and immediately after, we saw a massive push by Britain's Electoral Commission to try and nullify what happened there on June the 23rd, 2016. I remember I was there that day. I was there the weeks beforehand. I helped in the campaign, and I helped out afterwards as well, looking into the Electoral Commission. All of them globalists. All of them wanted to stop Brexit. You want to hand over the power, the reins of who weighs in when there's a dispute in an election to unelected bureaucrat, and you want to take it away from the only people who the people can recall, their representatives who they elect. That is a step closer and closer and closer to tyranny through the administrative state. France has very much a similar situation. They have this constitutional council. But this constitutional council in France has never had to weigh in to a presidential election that was disputed like this, like they're saying the one in the United States is going to be on November the 4th, right up until January 19th. No, the Constitutional Council of France has never been called in for that. So there is no actual precedent for those systems being better. All the left cares about is that notionally they work better for the left. I want you to look out very closely for this narrative, because it was in 1876 in the United States that there was an electoral commission established, a temporary one, to deal with that Rutherford B. Hayes election. And they're going to want to do it again this year. And this time they don't want it to be temporary. This time they want it to be permanent. This time they want to rig the system for good. And the book I carry around with me, Ballot Battles, by Professor Edward Foley, says this, quote, France places the authority to resolve a disputed presidential election in its Conseil Constitutionnel, an appointed body of prominent dignitaries as well as former presidents who refrain from further office seeking, but the body has yet to be tested in a situation like Bush v. Gore. France has never had a presidential election close enough to require invocation of this dispute resolution mechanism, end quote. So Dan Coates is pulling straight from Ed Foley, and Ed Foley is directly linked with the Transition Integrity Project. Is the former director of national intelligence of the United States colluding with Soros and CCP-linked groups to remove a sitting president? You bet he is. This is treason of the highest order. And speaking of Soros, because we're on this network, we're allowed to. What's the deal with Newt Gingrich being told he's not allowed to raise the specter of Soros on Fox News yesterday? Let's roll that clip.
Yeah, look, the number one problem in almost all these cities is George Soros elected left-wing, anti-police, pro-criminal district attorneys who refuse to keep people locked up. Just yesterday, they put somebody back on the street who's wanted for 2 different murders in New York City. You cannot solve this problem, and both Harris and Biden have talked very proudly about what they call progressive district attorneys. Progressive district attorneys are anti-police, pro-criminal, and overwhelmingly elected with George Soros' money, and they're a major cause of the violence we're seeing because they keep putting the violent criminals back on the street.
I'm not sure we need to bring George Soros into this.
I was going to say you get the last word, Speaker.
He paid for it. I mean, why can't we discuss the fact that millions of dollars he spent?
I agree with Melissa. George Soros doesn't need to be a part of this conversation.
Okay. So it's verboten.
All right, we're going to.
For those who don't know, the person shouting, "No, he didn't," and demanding the conversation comes to an end is Marie Harf, the former senior strategist for John Kerry, one of the lead architects of the disastrous Iran nuclear deal. By the way, here's what Harf is most famous for. Let's roll this.
Enough of them?
We're killing a lot of them, and we're going to keep killing more of them. So are the Egyptians, so are the Jordanians. They're in this fight with us. But we cannot win this war by killing them. We cannot kill our way out of this war. We need, in the longer term, medium and longer term, to go after the root causes that leads people to join these groups, whether it's lack of opportunity for jobs.
We're not going to be able to stop that in our lifetime or 50 lifetimes. There's always going to be poor people. There's always going to be poor Muslims. And as long as there are poor Muslims, the trumpet's blowing. They'll join. We can't stop that, can we?
We can work with countries around the world to help improve their governance. We can help them build their economy so they can have job opportunities for these people. You're right. There is no easy solution in the long term to preventing and combating violent extremism. But if we can help countries work at the root causes of this, what makes these 17-year-old kids pick up an AK-47 instead of try to start a business?
Jobs for ISIS. This is who Fox News is letting control what can and can't be said on their daytime programming. I'll say it. I'll say the words, because you're not allowed to say it on Fox. George Soros, George Soros, George Soros, George Soros. What's that in my ear? Oh yeah, nothing. Because this network will talk about the nefarious influence of George Soros. They were shouting over a former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who did nothing but point out accurate information about George Soros, who proudly and openly funds district attorney races across the country. Why don't they want people knowing this right now? Because many of these DAs are going to try and be involved in the election dispute process after November the 3rd. We've seen it already in the past year where a Surf City DA recused himself after one of his prosecutors spoke at a candidate's rally. That candidate went on to face 6 felony charges, later reduced to just 1 misdemeanor regarding errors on past voter and campaign forms. I want you to look closely at that clip from Fox again, really quickly. Just take a look at the last few moments here before the network unceremoniously dumps former Speaker Gingrich.
I was going to say you get the last word, Speaker.
He paid for it. I mean, why can't we discuss the fact that millions of dollars he spent?
I agree with Melissa. George Soros doesn't need to be a part of this conversation.
Okay. So it's verboten.
All right, we're going to. Okay, we're going to move on.
That moment of silence, dead air on national television, in case you don't know how TV works behind the scenes, that silence is a producer in Fox host Harris Faulkner's ear telling her to dump out of the segment. In other words, censor a guest talking about George Soros. And that brings me right back to the Transition Integrity Project and one of its co-founders, Nils Gilman. On August the 18th, Nils Gilman, the guy who works at the CCP-linked Berggruen Institute, gave an interview with the left-wing Vox website and said this of who calls the election night winner in the United States. He said, quote, "Ultimately, it's not the news anchors who's going to decide. It's actually ultimately Lachlan and Rupert Murdoch who are going to decide. Those guys on the evening lineup check in with the boss. So the question really is, what will those senior leaders be willing to countenance?" Is that what we saw last night from Fox? Lachlan and or Rupert Murdoch making the call that there can be no conversation about George Soros because of his involvement with the coup, the Transition Integrity Project, and the DA races up and down the country. It sure seems like it. And just minutes before this show today on Real America's Voice, I got a call from a senior Fox News staffer who confirmed to me that the network discourages discussion of Soros because management claims it's anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic. Talking about an atheist who hates Israel is anti-Semitic now. Fox News, at least in the daytime, is turning into bizarro world. It's extraordinary stuff. When we come back, I'll be speaking with Congressman Jim Banks about another turncoat from the political right. Former House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce, who recently registered as a lobbyist for the Chinese Communist Party-linked tech giant Tencent, which helps implement the Chinese Communist Party's censorship and surveillance regime. Congressman Banks has some solutions to this abuse of public trust and this position that he's in, the swamp. This is the National Pulse, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the National Pulse. I'm Raheem Kassam, editor-in-chief of the National Pulse. I'm delighted to say we have back just one of my favorite guests, one of my favorite people. Congressman Jim Banks joins us down the line now to talk about Ed Royce, California Republican, so maybe no surprises, I don't know, who is now registered as a lobbyist for the Chinese tech giant Tencent. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us here on the show today.
With you, Raheem.
Hey, Congressman, drain the swamp, right? Those words mean as much, if not more, today than they meant 4 and 5 years ago. The swamp appears to be thriving despite the best efforts of people like yourself, despite the best efforts of the President of the United States. There are inroads being made. There's no doubt about that. But when you see somebody like I guess somebody who was in your party, a former colleague of yours per se, joining up with Tencent, a Chinese Communist Party linked company, to lobby here in the United States. I mean, what is going on here?
Yeah, this would be funny, Raheem, if it wasn't so sad that a former senior member of the House leadership who chaired the House Republican, it was the chair when the House Republicans were in the majority of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I served for one term with him, his final term. He was outspoken about China, probably because it was politically expedient at the time for him to be. Now he's on the outside. Now he's a lobbyist, and he picks up a major contract to lobby for Tencent with substantial ties to the Chinese Communist Party. So you have a guy who stood for one thing in Congress, but now he's bought off by the Chinese Communist Party as a lobbyist. This says a lot more about the tactics of the CCP than it probably does about Ed Royce. These are the types of links that the Chinese Communist Party will go to buy off people of influence to lobby the House. We've seen this with Samir Jain, who was a senior Obama official who went to lobby for Huawei. Washington, D.C., the swamp is filled with examples like these, but it's long time that we do something about it. I introduced a bill. I hope we can talk about it a little bit today, several months ago, that was more related to Samir Jain, but now it's just as related to the situation with Ed Royce as well, that says that if you had a political job of any sort with a security clearance, you can't lobby for an adversary for at least 5 years, at which point your security clearance would expire. You can't profit off of a security clearance that you were given because of the public trust that was entrusted in you through your political or governmental position. That's the sad part about this. Is that's exactly what's happened with Samir Jain and Ed Royce both.
Well, I do want to actually talk about your bill, because you obviously predicated this on something else, but it seems prescient as well when it comes to this, because these keep popping up. We keep seeing people on both sides of the political aisle here in Washington, D.C. signing up as lobbyists, FARA registering to represent some of the most heinous regimes that are operating around the world, whether it's the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's the government of Qatar. You've got all of these different lobbyists popping up here and there. So what does the bill do? And I guess most importantly, all of these people who spend all this time in the House and spend all this time on Capitol Hill alongside you, don't they look forward to the day where they actually don't get re-elected and they can go out and make real bucks doing this lobbying? So why would they vote for your bill?
Yeah, that's a good question. The name of the legislation is the Safe Career Transitions for Intelligence and National Security Professionals, which is a mouthful. But the premise of the bill is that, once again, you can't profit off of your security clearance. Now, all members of Congress are given a security clearance the day that you're elected and sworn into office, because some of us, like I serve on the House Armed Services Committee, all of us are expected to vote on legislation that has consequences based on information that can only be shared in classified settings. So what happens in too many cases is you have someone like Ed Royce, who's chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who's privy to classified information. He leaves Congress, but his security clearance is still good for 5 years, in most cases, after he leaves office. Or an administration official who was appointed to their job that has a security clearance is the same situation. You should never be able to profit off of that security clearance. But that's what both of these guys have done in both of these situations, to go lobby on behalf of Huawei, on behalf of Tencent, which are entities that are propped up on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. This is a common sense solution to prevent individuals like these from doing that. I wish we could go further. I wish we could say altogether that you can't lobby on behalf of an adversarial country or entities that represent them. But I was told when I wrote the bill that there were constitutional issues that prevented me from writing a bill that would be broader. But this is a good step forward that would prevent situations like the ones that we're talking about, especially the Ed Royce situations, which is one of the most egregious examples of the swamp that I've seen in 4 years.
Well, I'd like to understand what those constitutional, blocks are. I don't understand why you should be able to lobby for any country, ally or adversary, if you have benefited via your public service from intelligence reports, all of this stuff. It just doesn't make any sense to me. You're giving or agreeing or potentially giving national security secrets, or at least you're able to act on what you know about national security while coining in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars as a result of all this. Shouldn't there just be an outright ban on this, Congressman?
Yeah, there should, and we're still looking for the best solution to accomplish that. But in the meantime, this piece of legislation that we introduced nearly a year ago, based on the Samir Jain situation, is a good step forward. I mean, at this point, Raheem, most members of Congress, at least on the Republican side, agree that China is the greatest existential threat that America faces economically and militarily. And in fact, if you found public statements from most, at least Republican members of Congress, a lot of Democrats too, who aren't talking about these issues anymore because Speaker Pelosi has threatened them not to be on the same side as President Trump, who's been the toughest president that we've ever had when it comes to addressing the China threat. But if we accumulate all of these public statements that members of Congress have made about China, there will probably be more cases down the road where some of these members leave Congress, and then they get their pockets filled by Communist Party type entities like the United Front and other groups that are trying to funnel money into their pocket.
Stick around. We're going to jump to a quick break. I want you to hang around. I know more people want to hear from you on this. Congressman Jim Banks has a bill which looks into all of this. You can follow him at Rep. Jim Banks on Twitter. This is the National Pulse. I'm Raheem Kassam with Jim Banks. We'll be right back in a second. Welcome back to the National Pulse. Later on in the show, our guest will be Matt Palumbo. He's got a new book out, Dumb and Dumber, How Cuomo and de Blasio Ruined New York. We're very excited to talk to Matt Palumbo, who's one of the content managers over at the Bongino Report. Our guest in this segment is Congressman Jim Banks, one of my personal favorites, just so eloquent, always making moves, always doing things from an America First perspective, and just somebody who's just such an amazing patriot. Congressman, thank you for holding over with us. I wanted to just ask you this very simple question. Shouldn't it be okay to talk about George Soros and his influence in U.S. elections?
The very fact that George Soros spends billions of dollars to affect the American elections, not just this cycle, but in many cycles in the past, because of that, very much so, Raheem, we should talk about the role that he plays in America. Some of us would like to look into the funding sources of the riots that have occurred around America. Congressman Buck from Colorado, myself, and others have called for the different investigative committees in the House, like the Oversight Committee, to look into where some of the funding comes from. I imagine we find out that Soros-type funding has gone into fueling some of the violent protests that have occurred around America as well. So this is absolutely a target and an issue that we should be talking about because it drastically affects where America goes from here.
And is in fact behind the Transition Integrity Project as well. I mean, they're very clear about it in their own words. With the Open Society Institute's Rosa Brooks, who is the former lead counsel for Mr. Soros, is the director of that organization. They're partnered with the Berggruen Institute. And I don't think it's just Soros, by the way. We don't have to get myopic about this sort of thing. There are plenty of places that we should be looking into, whether it's the Ford Foundation and all these other organizations that funnel money around. We learned yesterday from some reporting in the conservative media about the Black Lives Matter organization, the wider movement behind Black Lives Matter, being linked directly with some old Chinese Communist Party front groups, some old Marxist groups that were founded back in the 70s. So it's all of this we want to look into. And I just look, as somebody who has worked in pro-Israel advocacy all my adult life, I've been to Israel. I was there during Operation Cast Lead. I was in Jerusalem when the rockets started going off, the sirens started going off. I've worked with the Conservative Friends of Israel groups. I've worked with Holocaust memorial groups. I just can't countenance being called an anti-Semite because I want to look into the influence on an election from an over anti-Semite himself. That wasn't George Soros is a guy who funds anti-Israel projects, and he's an avowed atheist. He doesn't have anything to do with Judaism, and I just won't accept it. I won't allow it. And I'm grateful that you seem committed to the truth in this realm as well. I mean, you look at how all of this is coming together right now with the Transition Integrity Project. I said on Monday on both this show and on the War Room show that we're going to see an electoral commission, and that Nancy Pelosi is going to come out and say we should have an electoral commission. She will do that, by the way. Dan Coates' op-ed today in the New York Times is very explicit, and it's all in this playbook of theirs, this ballot battles playbook that I carry around everywhere. Congressman, I wanted to get your thoughts on that really quickly. Should there be an electoral commission? I mean, why are they even floating this in advance of the election? You don't know that there's going to be a disputed election. Oh, but they do, because they intend to dispute it no matter what the result.
Yeah, Raheem, to go back to your George Soros question, these left-wing groups have a political agenda, and it's an agenda to destroy President Trump. It's an agenda to destroy the very foundation and nature of what makes America great, and fundamentally change who we are as Americans in the future of this country. And as you've exposed more than anybody else at all, Raheem, this project and the left-wing groups that fund it, they're already laying the groundwork to delegitimize the election. They know President Trump is in a position to win. That's why they're floating the red mirage narrative. And it's a narrative that when my constituents in Northeast Indiana hear this narrative, They know exactly what these left-wing groups are up to, and it's to delegitimize the election. We can't allow them to do that.
Congressman, you have a new bill out today, and it's the first interview about it, exclusive interview about your bill, and we're very grateful for it here on the Real America's Voice Network on the National Pulse Show. Can you tell us more about your new bill?
Yeah, the United Front, Raheem, is one arm of the Chinese Communist Party that is used to fund their efforts of manipulation and their propaganda campaign around the world, but specifically and maybe most effectively so in places like the United States of America. So my bill that we introduced today would sanction the United Front. And what we're talking about with the United Front is a group that funds think tanks in Washington. It's a group that funds efforts on college campuses in the United States used for espionage and propaganda. This is a powerful entity within the Chinese Communist Party, and we should no longer turn a blind eye to it. I know President Trump is very much aware of how dangerous the United Front is, and my bill that I introduced today would sanction them and support this administration's efforts to rein in the China threat even further.
Well, Congressman, we're just incredibly grateful for you joining us, taking time out of your busy day to join us here to tell us about the bill and everything else that's taking place with Ed Royce and your previous bill. I think you're absolutely right. More power to your elbow, Congressman Jim Banks. At Rep Jim Banks on Twitter. Make sure you're following him. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And yourself. I want to bring Natalie Winters in now, our senior reporter at the National Pulse, to reflect on some of that. Natalie, you've got a new story up on the site as well. I want to walk through that between this segment and next. But just let's recap here for a second, because the Soros thing is absolutely everything as far as this election is concerned. He's plowed money into the DA races. It was back in 2018. He was talking about how many billions were being poured in between him and Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer. I can't understand it. I mean, I own every single book about Soros or by Soros. They're all on my bookshelves. Know Thy Enemy is something that I live my life by. How do you respond to this?
I think it's bizarre that Fox is essentially doing the same thing that you see the Transition Integrity Project doing, a bunch of these left-wing activist groups doing, and that they want to stifle conversation about George Soros, about these forces that are keen on undermining the election.
And what's your scoop?
And my scoop actually dovetails perfectly with what Representative Banks was talking about. So you have an individual named Anthony Fox. Not only does he describe himself as a, quote, friend of Joe Biden, he endorsed Joe Biden. He's on the board of the Biden Institute. And fourth, he was an Obama-era Secretary of Transportation. Okay, well, when we come back, you're going to talk to us about Anthony Fox and what Anthony Fox has been doing. It's a great scoop. It's over at thenationalpulse.com right now. I want everybody to grab it, share it, tweet it, post it on your Parler or Facebooks. Every single different type of group you're a part of. Things are heating up here. This is the National Pulse. I'm Raheem Kassam. We'll be right back after this short break. Well, somebody in the live chat just noticed that I'm wearing a pink shirt and Natalie Winters is wearing a pink shirt. We don't plan these things. I just want to make that very clear. Purely accidental. Natalie, your scoop on the lead story of the site right now. Biden Institute board member, Obama-era cabinet secretary, met with Chinese Communist Party to create more ties and visited a communist propaganda front. So who is Anthony Fox? Tell us more about this. Sure. So as I was saying, he worked in the Obama administration as a cabinet secretary. So it wasn't just some random low-level staffer. He severely influenced policy. He actually went on several tours around the country with Joe Biden, talking about transportation initiatives, energy initiatives. But interestingly enough, prior to his stint as a Secretary of Transportation, he was the mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. And as you said in reading the title, his sole goal was really to create, quote, more ties to China. By doing so, he visited... Hang on. More ties. We've got to get away from this more ties. It's more reliance on China.
it's creating more reliance on China, right? This isn't about helping Charlotte out. This is helping the Chinese Communist Party out.
Exactly. And when I say ties to China, I explicitly mean the Chinese Communist Party. Specifically, they collaborated on matters of energy and renewable energy initiatives, which not only go to undermine America's national security by making us more dependent on other countries for resources like oil and coal, but what's more, it really brings the Chinese Communist Party into our very secure infrastructure with regards to nuclear power, with regards to these energy sources. And the Chinese Communist Party is notorious for intellectual property theft, but Anthony Fox is welcoming them with open arms into his city's really energy infrastructure. But what's even worse, when Representative Banks was talking about the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda campaigns, another initiative, which is known as Confucius Institutes, very notorious, labeled a foreign mission by the Trump administration about a month ago. Well, Mr. Fox actually visited one, a 5th grade classroom. So he visited this. He offered the students participating in the program high praise. He thought it was amazing. There's glowing reports about his visit to the Confucius Institute all over Chinese state media.
It's like visiting Die Stürmer and saying, wow, you guys do a great editorial job. What does this do to Joe Biden's narrative that he's going to be tough on China?
Well, I'd also add that Joe Biden himself has visited Confucius Institute, so I think it goes to show that he'll fill his administration with fellow Chinese sympathizers.
It's extraordinary stuff. It's on the nationalpulse.com right now. We've got to take a quick break because I blew through in the A block. We'll come back in just a second. Well, we are committed on this show and on the National Pulse website to bringing you the news, but I'm also committed to bringing you some scuttlebutt from Washington, D.C. I want you to understand how this place works. It's not good. My next guest, Matt Palumbo, is the author of a forthcoming book, Dumb and Dumber, How Cuomo and de Blasio Ruined New York. You got the image on your screens there. Matt Palumbo will come on and tell you how to get that book when it comes out very soon. Matt, thank you so much for joining us here on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Raheem. It's going to be a lot of fun. Thanks.
Well, we'll see about that. I want to start off with a little bit of scuttlebutt from Washington, D.C. I want people to understand and get your opinion on how things like this happen. So Caitlin Collins is known as the incredibly hostile CNN reporter that goes into the press briefing room every day, screams through her mask, through that Fauci hijab at the press secretary, right? And she's very, very rude. I think Kayleigh McEnany deals with her quite well. She shuts her down quite well. She's always got a good fact-based, evidence-based answer to Caitlin Collins' increasingly hysterical questions in that room. But Caitlin Collins wasn't always an hysterical CNN reporter. In fact, she used to work for the conservative news outlet, the Daily Caller. And I want to play this clip of what Caitlin Collins said about George Soros on Fox News just a couple of years ago. Let's run it.
And I think that the Democratic Party needs to answer questions about this guy who they're so embedded with.
Sure. We know that Hillary Clinton has supported the Black Lives Matter movement. We also know, according to these leaked documents, apparently he supports some of these efforts that started with Ferguson, right, for social justice. Explain that.
Right. His Open Society Foundation has given over $500,000 to Black Lives Matter because they want to be able to support Black Lives Matter as it grows. They're worried, that they won't know how to grow properly, and they want to help them dismantle structural inequality. That was in one of the memos that was released in the data dump.
What does that mean?
They basically want to help Black Lives Matter further their agenda. And I think it's an issue also that the Democratic Party needs to address because so many Democrats have openly endorsed Black Lives Matter. And now that we see that this guy who is funding Hillary Clinton is also funding Black Lives Matter, that's a problem, and that's something that Americans should be aware of.
Absolutely.
George Soros is a problem that Americans need to be aware of. Not the words of the National Pulse, the words of Caitlin Collins, now CNN White House reporter, who was working for the Daily Caller and who was appearing on Fox News just a couple of years ago. So what's changed? What's changed with Caitlin Collins and what's changed at Fox News? Matt Palumbo is our guest in this segment. Matt, any ideas?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if that segment happened this week, Fox would have shut it down as it did with Newt. And, you know, what we're seeing with Caitlin, it just reflects what I think a lot of your audience knows, and that, you know, there's a lot of people in journalism that are, you know, more interested in promoting themselves than any ideology they claim to profess. You know, she's not the first person to, you know, to be on the right to go to CNN and act this way. There's Oliver Darcy, worked for The Blaze, and, you know, did man-on-the-street interviews on college campuses trying to school liberals. Who's the other one? S.E. Cupp used to be on Fox. Michelle Fields was a train wreck. And there's one more, Amanda Carpenter too. And you know, they all just act like mainline Democrats. And you know, maybe it's you just kind of become who you're around at that point. But or they just didn't really believe anything in the first place, and they thought, hey, you know, every single network except one is left wing. The one being Fox. And I mean, of the majors, obviously, you know, you're close second. But maybe they just thought, hey, there's more opportunity there, and just kind of went for it. But it's obviously very disappointing, and it proves that these people do know better, despite what they say.
That's exactly the point, isn't it, Matt? Is that it isn't that they're dumb. It's that they are selling out their own principles, or at least the principles they previously professed to hold. Oliver Darcy, Caitlin Collins, Michelle Fields, and these people, by the way, for the people at home who don't know how Washington, D.C. works, they have a lot of fancy dinners together with the likes of John Podesta over at the Ritz-Carlton. Oh, if you're watching, I know. I've seen the pictures. I can tell you what's going on in those conversations, in those rooms. And we will do that on this show, and we will continue to expose those things on this show. Washington, D.C. is a swamp run wild, and these people are the swamp monsters. Matt, you're working on a book right now. You're going to tell us, is it complete yet? It's called Dumb and Dumber, How Cuomo and de Blasio Ruined New York. A lot of people already, I can see, excited in the live chat about getting their hands on a copy of this book. So first, tell us about the book, and then tell us how we get the book.
Yeah, so I'll start with how to get it. It should be up for pre-order on Amazon before, I think, the week of the 28th. But, you know, I'll be tweeting about it, and I'm sure I'll, you know, annoy you into tweeting about it so your audience can find it. Now, the good thing about writing a book about Cuomo and de Blasio ruining New York is that it's very easy to do. In fact, it took me, I think, 2.5 months to put together. And, you know, the first draft is with the publisher, so it's all complete. Of course, the disclaimer is it's the kind of book you finish, and then a week goes by, and there's already, you know, 1,000 pages of more material to go through. So, you know, I'm sure if it does well, there could be a second or third volume. Now, as to what the book's about, I divided it into 3 sections. So I did the first on coronavirus, which, you know, if to give an analogy, like if New York's failure is a growing bubble about to burst, I think the coronavirus kind of is what pricked the bubble, and finally was the catalyst to get a lot of people to leave who are not going to come back. So I document all their failures in combating coronavirus, and it's actually relevant to the national debate because, you know, Trump always calls it the China virus, and that's true on a global scale, but in the terms nationally, it's the New York virus. It started there. They kind of ignored it and had a do-nothing attitude. Even if, you know, regardless of your positions on lockdowns, they did every other possible thing wrong you could do. You know, the most notable being mixing senior citizens in nursing homes with coronavirus patients. So I just go through all their policies, and then I document, too, how they export it to the rest of the country, and how really, if they had this thing contained, it would have been much better. You know, Sweden is the cautionary example of what not to do because they never had a lockdown, but New York had 3 times as many deaths per capita as Sweden. So despite all the media hysteria, they kind of got that one backwards. You know, the next 2 sections of the book, the next is on economics, so I just document.
Matt,
you know, there's really.
Matt, just hang on, Matt, hang on, because we've got to go to a break in just a second. So you're going to come back with the next 2 segments of that. But just tell our audience where they can follow you, so that when the book comes out, they know where to go. Because, like the genius you are, you haven't put up a holding page yet, or a landing page for people, like I told you to do.
I don't know how to make it. You need your help, Raheem. But it's twitter.com/MattPalumbo12.
Okay, make sure you're following Matt on Twitter. We're going to come back. We've got another segment with Matt. He's going to tell us about the rest of his book, the next 2 segments of the book. It's called Dumb and Dumber, How Cuomo and de Blasio Ruined New York. We'll be back with more National Pulse, Real America's Voice, after this break. Well, you heard in the first segment on this show why Fox News cut off Newt Gingrich yesterday, and if you'd missed it, go back, check it out. We'll have the clips up on thenationalpulse.com, on Real America's Voice, all the social media channels, and I need you to share it with as many people as possible. And just so you know that we are equal opportunities critics here on the National Pulse, just think about it. Today we've criticized Dan Coates and George Soros, CNN and their reporters, but also Fox News and Republican Ed Royce. So we will call out the swamp wherever it is. That's why a lot of people say to me, Raheem, I worry about your safety and your security. Well, I can tell you, the audience, I have no suicidal thoughts. I am in perfect health. So if anything happens to me, you know what's been going on. Matt Palumbo is our guest in this segment. He's the author of Dumb and Dumber, How Cuomo and de Blasio Fund New York. He's also content manager at the Bongino Report, one of the new great aggregators pulling away from the increasingly left-wing Matt Drudge. Matt, just before the break, you told us about the first segment of your book. Tell us about the next two.
Yeah, so the second segment's all on the economics in New York and just, how they're lagging the rest of the nation, the stats and why everyone's leaving. And then I just kind of document all the reasons why people are leaving, what the taxes are like, what the regulations are like, what the cost of living is like, what your just general quality of life is. And, I compare them to Florida, which is the #1 state people are leaving for, and just show how, Florida's government is roughly half as big as New York, and yet they're getting, the same, if not better, social services. So, why pay double when you don't need to? And that's, I think, actually the second longest chapter. And then the third chapter, or section of the book rather, is on a history of law and order in New York City. So I just kind of talk, and that's more the de Blasio focused chapter, although I do talk about bail reform, which is the Cuomo policy. And I just walk through the history of, hey, it was only 50 or not even years ago that New York City was more or less uninhabitable because of crime. And this is what the scenario was like. Here's all the specific policies Giuliani implemented and all the problems he identified. And I just kind of show today, like, every single thing that was a problem in the 70s and 80s until Giuliani is slowly coming back. And, crime didn't really start to come back until the past year or two, but that just has been lagging all these other things that have been happening. And I just don't think it's going to be that positive. I mean, we have bail reform, so I think 90% of criminals are now getting out. We had hundreds of people let out for COVID, and when they started committing crimes, de Blasio's reaction was shocked that they weren't appreciative that they got left out. And it's just like, when this is the kind of people you're dealing with, how can you really have hope that there's going to be any common sense applied anywhere?
Just want to make something clear as well. Let's keep this two-shot up here, right? Because I like this. This isn't Matt like just being in a bigger box than me. This is actually the scale of us, right? His head is actually the size of my entire body. That is how big Matt Palumbo's head is. Matt, just give us your Twitter handle again so people can follow you to make sure they know when to get the book.
Matt Palumbo 12, and I'm sure you'll tweet out my handle too, in case.
And also, I want to make sure you come back when the book comes out and when the pre-order's up. We'll have you back a bunch on this show. This audience keeps growing and growing, and we're incredibly grateful to you and the Bongino Report for linking to the National Pulse. Just remind our audience, if they don't know what the Bongino Report is, inform them. Tell us how it works, how you came about working on this.
Yeah, so I've known Dan Bongino actually for about 7 years or so now. He just started reading some of my writing back when I was in college. And then he had the idea for Bongino Report, I think probably around September or October of last year. Just reached out to me randomly and asked if I'd be interested in running something like that. And it's funny, I had the idea of like an aggregator type site 6 months before that I obviously never went through with. So I just thought, oh, that's perfect, and it'll have his name on it so people will actually read it. And I think it's been 8 or 9 months since we started it, and we've been growing pretty much every month since. And it's just, we like to say we're like the Drudge Report if Drudge was good.
Yeah. What happened to Drudge?
Well, that's the thing. I don't think anyone knows. I mean, there was one theory that he sold the site, and you'd assume that when your brand is linked, like your name is linked to a brand like Drudge, you probably wouldn't be able to reveal like publicly that you sold it. Like there might be an NDA where you can't disclose that. But then again, it's completely unprovable. I think you did an interview recently with Citizen Free Press, and he argued that Drudge actually was still in charge. And Tucker Carlson said the same. So I'm not sure what his motivation is. I mean, one explanation is that he's not happy with Trump, but I don't know which issues he'd be unhappy with. Or the second one is that I remember Tucker saying he did better traffic-wise when Obama was president because it's easier to get clicks, I guess, against the opposition. But it just makes no sense from like a business model perspective. Like there's no overlap between the audience he's targeting by attacking Trump and his current audience. So I'm not really sure what he's thinking. But if he wants to send viewers my way, I can't really complain, I guess.
Who's a worse turncoat, Matt? Caitlin Collins or Matt Drudge?
I guess Drudge, just because he has no reason. I mean, he was the king of aggregation. There's no reason for him to do the 180. At least with Collins, she is probably making better money, but I can't confirm that.
Matt, we've got about a minute left here. Just tell us where people can find the Bongino Report and where they should follow the Bongino Report.
Yeah, so we're on Parler, Twitter, and Facebook, and then the site is obviously just BonginoReport.com. And if you want to send it to your homepage, it's a lot easier to not forget.
Matt Palumbo, incredibly grateful for you joining us here today, author of Debunk This and the new book that's coming out very soon, Dumb and Dumber, How Cuomo and de Blasio Ruined New York. Matt Palumbo, thanks again for joining us here on the National Pulse.
My pleasure. It was fun after all.
I don't know about that. All right, well, we'll be back tomorrow at 3 p.m. with another packed out show, and we're incredibly grateful to all of our supporters out there of the National Pulse. If you want to support, every Friday we read out the names, not the full names because we don't want you doxxed or anything like that, but we read out the partial names of our supporters here on our website. We don't do any paywall or anything like that. It's just up to you guys. If you want to be what we call nationalist over at the National Pulse, then you go to thenationalpulse.com/support. Alternatively, you can go to fundrealnews.com and join up, because look, ladies and gentlemen, the pitch is very simple. We don't have big pockets. We're not some huge corporate enterprise. We don't have sponsorship coming in from the Chinese Communist Party or any big lobbying contracts or anything like that. We are just who we are. I am just who I am. And we started the National Pulse at the beginning of this year, and we're on track for a record-breaking traffic month. And it's because of people like you taking our stories, sharing them, taking clips from the show and sharing them, downloading the Real America's Voice app on your Roku device, on your Apple TV, getting Pluto, tuning in every single day, whether you have it on in the background or your eyes are glued to the screen. We're incredibly grateful for all of you. thenationalpulse.com/support. We'll see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Thank you.